from a conference called Future of Local Government held in Victoria by the Municipal Association of Victoria. And
everyone here? Yep, okay.
Okay.
Good. Yep.
And it was aimed at reforming local government to face the challenges of the next 5 years in particular. The challenges of peak oil and climate change, which are going to hit us hard and soon. It was very similar to, well, many of the ideas were similar to those in transition towns, but interestingly, that was hardly mentioned. Bill Harvey was there as well. There were two other councillors from Tasmania, Eva Rosica and Ian Howard from Meander Valley. There were two overseas speakers, one from the United States, from New York State, where they've had $3 billion cut out of their public service and lost 17,000 jobs from schools, which means that most of the teachers who've come into the system in the last 6 years are now out. We had a speaker from the UK, talked about David Cameron's idea of big society, which basically means transferring the responsibilities of government to the community. And of course, I guess this is pushing for transition, but maybe not doing it in the right way. Because the theme of this conference, at least on the first day, was it's all about community. And one of the first talks we had was from Campaspe Shire. And I still don't really know where that is, but it sounded fascinating. It's in rural Victoria. And in 2004, the Shire Council started the process of community planning. And this was to involve everyone in making the transition to a more sustainable community. We had a talk from a resident of a small town called Gingari, Jan Smith, she was called. And Gingari was a small town that was dying after the closure of the local cheese factory. 7 years ago, Council started this process of community planning for all the small towns in its shire. And the process has evolved over the years. It's been reviewed by Council last year, and it's been now being reflected on by Council. So the conclusions are that councils need to support the process, but it must be driven by the community. So the role of the council then decreases as the community becomes more self-confident and more resilient. So the message was that councils must be enablers, not blockers, as we sometimes see. Councils must support their communities, but they can't provide the answers. These answers will be different for each community, and the answers must come from that community. The process that Jan Smith described for Gingara was very similar to that for transition towns. They started with an event that gathered people to find new ways of working together, and, as she said, to not fight each other, which I thought was a really good place to start. So, the Gingara community started a farmers market in 2005 because it was the only thing that they could think of to do. They started with 8 stalls. Now they have 120 stalls, and they have 40 volunteers from within the town. They also have started an annual music festival which concentrates on having workshops for beginners and is known for that in Victoria. The next thing that the council did was to link the communities together. And they started, I think that Gingara was probably the initiating one. They formed these talented tiny towns. And all these towns started working together and helping each other. Because it's often just a question of making a phone call to the right person, but until you know who the right person is, you can't make that phone call. One of the very interesting things that I saw coming out of that were that they identified 4 different kinds of people in the community. These were the dreamers, the ideas people. Lots of ideas, but they don't actually go on and do it. Then there were the designers. The designers are the people who work out how to make the project work. And then the evaluators. The evaluators question the ideas. Sometimes they're called the knockers. And these people think through the details of a project and what might go wrong and how, and so they make the project actually work. And then there are the doers, the organisers. These are the people that book the events, that make the posters, that just build the websites, that make the food for the event and all those things. So there are always plenty of doers in the community, you just have to find them. And I've added a couple more. You've got to have recruiters and you've got to have networkers. You need all these types of people within the community. And one of the important issues is that you have to mentor new people all the time. Because if it's all just left to a small group, then they get tired and go away. So another of the issues that was discussed was community governance. What happens if the community decides that it wants something that is not within council policy? This is where councils have to start being more flexible and thinking outside their normal parameters. We had another talk about the Golden Plains Shire from a man called Lenny Jenner who used to work there. Anybody know where Golden Plains Shire is? Yes! It's between Bendigo and Ballarat, and it's kind of a sliver of country. It apparently has 35 small towns with populations of around 1,000 each. And in the whole shire, they had, and still have, I think, one GP, one pharmacy, one dentist, no secondary school, and no public transport. So when peak oil hits, it's going to hit a community like this very hard. So the Golden Plains Shire started community planning in each one of these small towns. And each town had a small win early on that boosted the confidence of that town. And council decided that it would provide community grants to help them along the way. Having got this community building going, they started a health planning forum. And one of the issues among many, many, including mental health, was transport. So they got a student to do the research, put a plan together, and they didn't have to reinvent the wheel because this has been done elsewhere before. They then got help from the state government because they had such a good plan, and now they have community transport, which is used by 7,500 people each year. So that's a real success story for the Golden Plains Shire. What are the challenges? Well, the challenge for community planning for councils is that the community start to think much more deeply about issues. And therefore, they raise much more complex issues with council. And often, the council isn't in the position to respond. So the message that came from that to the councils was, be careful what you wish for. We also had a talk from Graham Sampson, who's the CEO of the Australian Centre for Excellence in Local Government. And his view is that councils need to develop both local democracy and they need to develop the strategic capacity of the community. And the questions that he's left us with are, one, who is developing the capacity of councils to deal with complex changes? And these complex changes, of course, are peak oil and climate change, which we're all going to be facing in the next few years. And are councils getting left behind by their communities, which are becoming increasingly more knowledgeable on these issues? So those provide us with us as councillors, provide us with food for thought. The very last talk of the session of the second day was by Mike McCallum from the Global Foresight Network. So we didn't get much time to digest this, and he raised so many issues that I think our minds were just totally spun out by the end of his talk. But the one thing that he talked about that nobody else had talked about during the 2 days was food production. Land use planning is mostly the role of local government, and local councils have to make decisions between using their arable land for housing or for food production. State governments sometimes make the decisions for them, but it's basically a very important decision that councils have to make. The organisation Australia 21 has a sustainable food lab. And this is starting the conversation about transition in food production. It's of course affected by peak oil, but we also have increasing population. We have peak land and we have peak phosphorus. So we have lots of issues related to sustainable food production. He also talked about the rapid changes that are taking place in communications. Electronic media are now changing the way everybody does everything, and you only have to walk through the streets of Melbourne and you see everybody on their mobile or their iPod or whatever it is all the time. I was just blown away by that. But just as an example, in the ACT, everyone who puts in a building proposal now has to also put in a 3D virtual model of what they're proposing. And this is the kind of thing that's going to overtake us in the next couple of years, as well as the very fast communications. So the conclusions that I drew from this conference are that the community needs to and will drive the transition that's coming. And that local government needs to learn to work much more closely with its communities. And another issue that was raised was that councils need to start looking at the big picture of peak oil and climate change, and not just to stay bogged down in which roads they're going to repair this year and how much they're going to pay for collecting the rubbish. So for me, it was a really valuable conference. It reinforced a lot of things that I already thought, and it was a real buzz to see lots of other people thinking in the same direction. Thank you.